everyone who donates to the Asylum Seeker Resource Centre to help people like me. It's not easy being an asylum seeker, and it's not easy for Asylum Seeker Resources to support and doing wonderful job for people like me, to make them feel happy, feel like home. I thank them so much, and I thank the donors too. Thank you.
These people would be taking Australian jobs, there's no question about that. And for many of them that would be unemployed, they would languish in unemployment queues and on Medicare and the rest of it. So there would be a huge cost, and there's no sense in sugarcoating that. That's the scenario.
Hi, my name is Jan Wisniewski, and this is The Strife, a podcast to discuss issues in Australia with the long term in mind. For this episode, I added Jana Favero on Skype, and we had a chat about her work with the Asylum Seeker Resource Centre, where she's been working for the past 8 years. In a recent episode, I spoke to Professors Klaus Neumann and Anne McNevin about their ideas for fairer, more humane asylum seeker policies in Australia. They argued, pretty convincingly, that an alternative approach that spreads responsibility for people's safety and the costs involved across the region requires a fundamental rethink of how we are going about things currently. That's why I spoke to Jana about her role as a Director for Advocacy and Campaigns at the Asylum Seeker Resource Centre. She reveals the efforts to change attitudes to people seeking asylum and refugees in Australia, and how political rhetoric keeps us scared and our thinking confined. Alright, here's the interview. You're the Director for Advocacy and Campaigns at the Asylum Seeker Resource Centre, which is the largest independent human rights organisation supporting refugees and people seeking asylum in Australia. As far as I understand, the ASRC provides services to people seeking asylum while also advocating for their rights. Could you explain how the ASRC assists refugees and asylum seekers and outline what you do within the organisation?
The Asylum Seeker Resource Centre started about 16 years ago, and it sort of started from a very basic premise. Was our CEO, who is also the founder, Con Karapani-Yotidis, was running a social work class in Footscray, a suburb in Melbourne, and they decided to do a social work project which was having a look at an identified need in the area. And the students came up with a project which was giving food to people seeking asylum, because there were a number of people seeking asylum who seemed or appeared to not have enough food. So they really started as volunteers collecting food and then handing that food out. And from that point 16 years ago, the ASRC has now grown to supporting 4,500 people seeking asylum in Victoria. And the ethos of what it started with, which was volunteer-led and identifying a need or a gap in services to people seeking asylum, are the two things that have driven that growth as an organisation over the last 16 years. We still are majority staffed by volunteers. We have about 100 paid staff and over 1,300 volunteers, and we offer over 20 different programs and services to people seeking asylum. The food bank is still very much one of our key services, where we do provide fresh fruit and vegetables and food to people seeking asylum who don't have any income. We also have employment, education, a legal service to help people as they progress through the complicated legal process of seeking asylum in Australia. We have English classes, we have casework, counselling, a medical centre. So we offer a lot of direct service provision to people seeking asylum, and the only reason we have to exist is because they are not being treated fairly and there's policy failure in that area, so they can't access those services anywhere else. We also at the same time have a very clear vision to no longer need to exist and to close our doors. And the only reason we do exist, as I've touched on, is because people seeking asylum aren't treated fairly and don't have the same level of rights as other people in Australia, particularly those who arrive by boat. So while we are consistently responding to a need and, for a want of always being that ambulance, like just seeing people had to grow, we also recognise that we want to more proactively try and change the current policy towards people seeking asylum. So in 2015, we decided to create a specific focus and put resources into advocacy and campaigns, and that's the area that I'm the director of. I've actually been at the ASLC for 8 years, but we didn't ever really have advocacy as a separate role. It always sort of sat within someone's role across the organisation. But in 2015, we really decided to invest in that. So under advocacy and campaign sits our legal program, because we are directly providing services to people seeking asylum in the legal process, but that can then also inform advocacy. The ASRC is really in a unique position that what we're advocating for is actually being informed by what we're seeing on the ground, by what those 4,500 people are telling us would have the biggest change on their lives, the impact on their lives in terms of policy change. So we have the legal program, we have our community engagement and education program, which is sort of going out and trying to mobilise people around this as an issue, to take local action, to contact their local MP, and we have our campaigns program, which is really to highlight and put a spotlight on the issue of people seeking asylum. So that all sits under my area within advocacy and campaigns. So it's looking at directly responding to people's legal need, but also trying to change public opinion and also do political lobbying and law reform and policy work as well. So as you can see, it's a very big job, but it's also a very big organisation providing all of those services.
I would assume that most Australians are at least aware of the policies related to our border security, such as offshore detention or boat turnbacks. But there are other policies which you were referring to there that are affecting people already in Australia. Could you take us through some of the policies in place within Australia that affect refugees living here already?
Yeah, definitely. And look, it's very, very complicated. It would probably take a series of podcasts to be able to explain all the complications and intricacies with asylum policy affecting people who have actually arrived here. People are really treated differently as people seeking asylum depending on when they arrived and how they arrived. It has been a mandate of successive governments to really try and deter people seeking asylum by boat, and also that has stretched to now deter people seeking asylum full stop. You know, Australia is a proud signatory to the Refugee Convention, which was really set up post-Nazi Germany in response to recognising the plight of refugees and wanting to be able to offer refugees globally safety and protection. So we, in principle, signed up to the Refugee Convention, but our domestic asylum policies are really almost the opposite to offering that. So just as an example, if people have arrived by boat and they arrive in Australia, they seek asylum, they're found to be a refugee, they will never, ever be settled permanently in Australia. They will only get a temporary protection visa. They may or may not have the right to work. They may or may not, and generally are not able to reunite with their family. And then after 3 or 5 years, they have to reapply for protection. So one of the huge issues with domestic asylum policy is just about the right to permanency, that once you're found to be a refugee, it's not actually safe. You're constantly in limbo. As you go through that process of seeking refugee status, you may or may not have access to Medicare, you may or may not be able to work. If you can't work, you may or may not have income support. And so because of these punitive policies, we've really seen a spike in demand for our services. Some people are also in detention centres. There's a shroud of secrecy around what happens in detention centres. People don't really know their rights. People seeking asylum aren't necessarily afforded a lawyer. So that's the reason why we have our legal program, is because access to funded lawyers and representatives is really being slashed by the government. Recently, there have been some policy changes where previously people seeking asylum, if they were unable to work, because you've got to imagine some of these people, I mean, everyone who's found to be a refugee has got a well-founded fear of persecution, or if they return to their home country, there would be serious harm. So that in itself is traumatising, let alone then taking a journey to Australia and then possibly waiting up to 5, 7, 9 years in the Australian community, living in limbo. Some of that time may have been in detention. A lot of that time you haven't been able to work and you've had to live off some very meagre support services. Well, those support services that are funded are now being cut drastically by the government. So it's really a whole narrative against people seeking asylum and trying to deter people seeking asylum. So while offshore policy and what's happening on Manus and Nauru are awful, and those people should have their claims processed because they did arrive into Australia seeking safety, there are also a number of people in the community who arrived by a different method who are being punished because of the policies. And there are approximately, it's very hard, another thing is getting information from the government or the Department of Home Affairs, but we know that there are about 24,500 people who have been subjected to a new fast track process, which has really changed the way that they can apply for asylum in Australia. And plus there are probably about 10 to 15,000 other people. So you're talking about across Australia between fast track and other method or time or mode of arrival, about possibly 25 to 30,000 people nationally who are seeking asylum, are living in the community and really don't have access to the same level of supports as other people.
So this policy approach you were just outlining, based on the idea of deterring people coming to Australia, that kind of intensified focus on these sort of policies in recent years means the ASRC is receiving an ever-increasing workload and public profile as well. Absolutely.
I started ASRC 8 years ago. I think we had 13 staff. Now we have over 100. So it has increased significantly.
And I think, like you were saying earlier on in the interview, that actually the goal is to not exist at all, but in fact it's going the other way.
Yeah, and I have to say that, I've done an absolutely dismal failure at my position in 8 years, that the mandate on when I started Con said, we don't want to exist. And now the organisation has grown about 10 times since I started. So it's just, indicative of how the political climate towards people seeking asylum has also changed over that time. I am every day constantly astounded at the new policy changes that come into effect. It really is quite shocking, the attack on the rights of people seeking asylum.
Well, then maybe you could address how the Asylum Seeker Resource Centre is working to change these policies.
Yeah, we're doing it in a number of ways. Obviously, we do some direct political lobbying because the reason we have the policies are because of different politics. And it's, often said that politics poisons policy, and I think that that's absolutely the case in asylum policy. So we directly lobby all sides of the political parties in Australia. That has probably not been as effective because every time we go to Canberra and meet with politicians, they say you're not going to change the policy until you change hearts and minds of the average Australians. So that's something that we've really focused on over the last few years, is going and sort of running workshops and talking to people about how they can be effective advocates for change for people seeking asylum, how to have conversations with your family and friends and neighbours to talk about this as an issue so that we don't have 75% of people who think that offshore is a good thing. So really trying to change the policy through public attitude changing and public education and mobilising and organising, which is a large part of the work that we do. And then also running wide-scale campaigns of sort of talking about the fact that everyone does deserve the right to be free and to be safe, and it's very hard to argue with that. The big thing we're trying to do also is counter the government's rhetoric and narrative, which is quite often negative. And also, look, I took a trip to Manus Island at the end of last year and I came back and I was just like, wow, our government is really deceiving us. You had Amnesty, you had Get Up, you had the ASRC, you had UNHCR all saying that the transit accommodation was not ready, whereas the government was saying it was ready. And I went there, I saw it for myself, it wasn't ready. So a lot of what we've got to do is really up against, your key politicians, leaders of the country, key media spokespeople who are deceiving us about what is happening. So that's some of the work that we're trying to do as well, is work with media to actually get an accurate description of what's happening to people seeking asylum. As you said, probably most people don't know that there are people seeking asylum in our community who have been found to be refugees who can't even move on with their lives because they've only got temporary protection. Or there are people seeking asylum in our community who don't have the right to work, or don't have right to Medicare, who are homeless. So we have got a big job in terms of raising the awareness and putting a spotlight on the treatment of people seeking asylum, but also successive governments have been very, very, very successful in their narrative of smashing people smuggling business, stopping the boats. That is what everyone conjures up when they think of asylum policy, and we've got to go beyond that because, instead we've got to think, well, why do people get on boats? People get on boats because there's no other way for a safe passage. So instead of stopping the only option people have, shouldn't we look at possibly offering other safe passages so no one gets on boats rather than just boat turnbacks or people smuggling? So it's trying to have a conversation around those areas rather than just very simplistic, negative and demonisation of people seeking asylum. So, yeah, we're doing it through campaigning, through organising, encouraging people to contact their local MB, to speak to local talkback radio, and really making this an issue that shows the government that we are a caring, compassionate community and we won't stand by while people are being treated in such a punitive way.
Mm-hmm. I am curious about the responses you get from trying to have that conversation, because as you say, the rhetoric of governments and across Parliament has been obviously negative for, well, at least for my living memory in Australia.
Yeah.
So how do you even start these conversations?
We usually try and ground the conversations in something that's happened, for example, a policy change, and really talk from our experience as an organisation that works directly with people seeking asylum. That tends to have the most impact. I mean, it depends who we're talking to. To this date, we haven't had a sitting immigration minister agree to meet with us formally. We've had informal conversations with their officers, but, Dutton has rejected every request, or we just haven't heard back from a meeting with him. So it's really hard to even engage in a dialogue, first of all. So assuming we can get a dialogue, it depends on what that politician or party's position is. If they may have some positive elements, we do encourage them with that. If they're more negative, we try and show the devastating impacts of that policy on the mental, physical and emotional well-being of people seeking asylum. But as I said, that the message that we keep getting back is that this is just not an issue you're going to win until you change the hearts and minds of the Australian public. But it's very hard to change the hearts and minds when you've got your national government who are putting out a message that's very negative. You've got media who repeat that. And it really is an area where, yes, there's a lot of community leadership on this issue, but we do also need political leadership. And I think it is really passing the buck by saying, hey, you need to get the community to change its attitudes first. I mean, there were also community attitudes and resentment towards Vietnamese refugees under Malcolm Fraser's government, but they had a policy that they only put out public news stories about Vietnamese people arriving in Australia. That was what was printed, and that was what is accepted. Whereas now you've almost got an opposite policy that the government's only putting out negative messages. So it's reinforcing that and trying to get politicians to be brave and encourage them to speak out for a fairer and more humane policy for people seeking asylum, and saying this is not going to lose you votes. This is not going to mean that you can't then win a next election. So they are complicated and difficult conversations to have, but we're really always trying to ground it in what we're seeing on the ground and the experiences, but then also there is a vision and there is a different way. Like, for example, if someone arrives by plane, they're treated very differently from someone who arrives by boat. So we already do have some humane policies and practices in place. Our resettlement program is very generous and quite well supported. You could do a similar thing for people when they arrive as seeking asylum.
And how about those conversations with ordinary people? I assume that there are people who obviously who like to hear from you and agree with many of the points you make. There are obviously other people who probably dismiss any of your points outright. But I guess there is probably a middle ground there as well. How do you speak to those people?
I mean, look, you've got your people in Australia who are really championing more humane and compassionate policies for people seeking asylum. They're absolutely championing it, and that's great. Then you've got people who actually want harsher policies. And to be honest, if someone heart and soul believes that we should treat people seeking asylum more harshly, then they're probably not the group we focus on. There's more that middle ground of people who might think, oh, if you're a refugee, you're okay, but if you came by boat, no way, it's too dangerous, or we don't want you. So it's really focusing on those people who are undecided or could be influenced either way, and just talking to them about where do their concerns come from? Like, is it through misinformation, or B, is it from fear? And then just bringing it back to common values and saying, well, don't you think everyone deserves to be safe? I don't think I've met anyone so far where you sit on that spectrum who says no, and then you go back, well, if you deserve to be safe, everyone deserves to be treated fairly in the eyes of the law. Yes, of course they do. And then you talk about how people seeking asylum are not treated fairly. And generally, most reasonable people, when talk about what the actual situation is, they're really quite shocked and they can't believe what our government is getting away with. So it's really just about instead, we tried for many, many years to sort of give people mythbusters and fact sheets and didn't you know that we only take X amount of the world's refugees. And while those points are valid, it's not the way to lead an argument because you just make people feel as if they do or they don't know. Like if I led an argument with, but don't you know we don't actually take that many people or to drop in the ocean. Whereas by starting a conversation, we're sort of saying, don't you agree that everyone deserves to be treated fairly? Imagine if you had to go to a court case, wouldn't you want to be able to access a lawyer and to have the court hearing with a translator? And everyone's like, of course, it's got to be in your own language. So it's really appealing to those common values and things that we do share that, any caring person would be able to see, and then starting the conversation from that point of view. And that's the real model that we are having with any conversations. We found it has been very effective. We did a large piece of research, or we commissioned a large piece of research in the end of 2015, and the report that came out, Words at Work, really talked about the most effective ways to talk about the issue of people seeking asylum and what some words are to really embrace, which ones to possibly replace. And that has really informed how we do have a conversation with people, and it has been really effective because it's not so combative. Like, I know this, you're wrong, and I'm right. Like, it's actually this. It isn't about where you sit on politics. This is just about having a humane approach and everyone deserving to be free and fair and treated well and be safe. So we found that has been the most effective. We need to be having a lot more of those conversations, obviously, because the policies are still so punitive, but it has been heartening by talking to people and really getting across what is actually happening to see the responsiveness. Like ASRC is an independent organisation. We don't accept any federal government funding, so we have to raise over $10 million a year just from community, from donations from the general public. And we do it because you talk to people, you let them know about the issue. There are a lot of really, really good people in Australia who do care about people seeking asylum and refugees.
I think it might be worth, just now that you have sort of this tool for these words that you can use to have a conversation with people, I just wanted to bring up maybe one of the arguments that I hear quite often.
Yep.
And that kind of comes from the notion that Australians are happy, or a lot of Australians are happy to welcome people, refugees, when they feel they've gone through the correct process. And that's when the talk of skipping queues comes up, that people who arrive without approval are rorting the system, and that it is unfair to accept them over people seeking asylum who are rightly waiting their turn. How would you speak constructively about this idea?
Yeah, well, if someone is talking from that point of view, then they're obviously compassionate people, and they're not talking about whether or not we should accept people seeking asylum. They're talking about a concept of fairness. And I absolutely agree there should be a concept of fairness, but it's very difficult for some people to be able to go through official channels. For example, you can't leave some countries if you have been persecuted by that government officially. You can't get a visa for Australia. You just have to leave the way that you do. It would be like saying that everyone would accept that if you're sitting in the waiting room and your child has got a cold, but someone comes up and they've got a broken leg, that they do go straight through to emergency. This is in exactly the same situation. It's just about, it is actually fair that we do process everyone's claims and consider everyone's claims regardless of how they got here. Like we are a really compassionate country. We respond really well to times of crisis when there's been bushfire or there have been floods. This is just exactly the same for people seeking asylum. They're forced to leave somewhere. How they then got here and made their way here shouldn't be the issue. I mean, I don't think you would ever think that someone who's fleeing from their home in a bushfire, that they decide to drive to, I don't know, Ballarat versus Bendigo, that would not be judged. It would all be about, do you agree people should be safe? Absolutely yes. The only safe thing for someone to do was to get here by an irregular mean. And most people really then do accept it. And we purposefully don't go back into that language of jumping the queue or anything right way or wrong way, because you're just reinforcing the government's frame. And the more you do that, all people hear is right and wrong, jumping a queue. So it's about putting it more into the language and the frame that we want to, which is about being safe. If the safe thing means that you've got to get here on a leaky boat, then that's all that matters, is about seeking safety and about our obligations.
So we've spoken about the fact that you have the message and you have the ways to have these conversations now. and the growth of the ASRC as an organisation. And you did mention earlier on the focus on organising. So I just wondered, what is the importance for the Asylum Seeker Resource Centre in building partnerships and networks with other organisations to kind of grow that message, and how do you do so?
Yeah, I'm really glad you asked that question, because there is no way the ASRC could do this alone. We rely on an incredible network of other refugee rights and service delivery organisations across the country. One, to just be able to coordinate the delivery of services. We work very closely with other organisations, but also to be able to effectively advocate. There are hundreds of amazing grassroots groups like your Amnesty groups, Oxfam groups, Mums for Refugees, Rural Australians for Refugees, who are doing incredible work on the ground. And so we really see our responsibility as trying to upskill, provide resources to those groups to do what they do best. And that's really what we're about, and sharing the research that we've found with those groups, because we can't do it alone. We're based in Melbourne, we're based in one state. Mm-hmm. You need to have that national reach. You need to be changing attitudes and having the conversations across the country. If I turned up to a town hall meeting in Perth, I would have absolutely no legitimacy. Why would people, I'm a refugee rights advocate. People expect me to talk about refugee rights. Whereas if you've got the local mayor in Perth who holds a town hall meeting and talks about why this is an issue, people step up and listen. So we work with other organisations and on-the-ground groups and organising, because they're the experts in their area. They have those place-based relationships, and that's the only way that we will change attitudes. So it is so important, the collaboration and coordination with other organisations, whether they're really large ones or smaller, a group of 5 people who meet every week to write a letter to the Minister of Home Affairs and talk about why people seeking asylum should be treated fairly. And it's also, we know that local-based action is most effective. You build a relationship with your local MP, and that's what they listen to. That's what they raise in Canberra. They're not going to raise something from me as a director of advocacy at ASRC. They'll raise it from Sarah and Bob, who have been supporting someone seeking asylum in their local community in an outer suburb in Sydney. So it's really the power of the message and who's delivering the message as well, and the advocacy. So A, we just couldn't simply do it alone, and B, we're not best placed to do some of that work. It is so important to build relationships with your local members of parliament and with different influences in your community and local media. So that's really where the power is, and that's the only way the organising model will truly be effective, is through this sort of, to use some jargon, decentralised organising. Like, it's not as if ASRC are forming all these groups and sending them out to do something. It's got to be really authentic, because the asylum issue is so broad. People care about people in detention. They care about people on Nauru. They care about people who came by boat. They care about family reunions. Such a complex area that we really want people to be able to talk to what they care about, because it's authentic and genuine, and that tends to have the most powerful when you are trying to talk to someone else about the issue. So we do work with a lot of other organisations, and it's going to be absolutely critical to get a fairer and more humane policy as all organisations working together and supporting the work of each other.
Mm-hmm. Maybe just to finish then, as we've been talking about your work and building a community to change the policies that seem to be entrenched at the moment, maybe you could just outline some of the organisation's goals and the community's goals for 2018 and what campaigns you're focusing on at the moment.
Yeah, we see 2018 as a pretty huge year for us. We think it will be a challenging year, just given that year-on-year policies seem to be getting harsher towards people seeking asylum, but also it being a really powerful year for change. And so we're really focusing on making change this year through our campaigns and our organising. It's also possibly going to be a federal election in 2018, which always highlights this issue even more. So we've really got 5 key areas of policy change that we would like to see. We've really clearly articulated those in 5 policy position papers, and we're going to be campaigning specifically around those 5 areas of change. And as I mentioned before, all of our advocacy on policy areas are informed by what would make the biggest impact on people seeking asylum. So Those 5 areas are, firstly, it's a universal safety net. So that means that everyone seeking asylum has the right to work, has the right to study, has the right to adequate counselling and casework support, and also has the right to income support if for some reason, due to vulnerabilities, they are unable to work. Secondly, it's about a fair process, so that people seeking asylum, when they arrive in Australia and they have to navigate the legal process of making a refugee claim, are treated fairly, because at the moment the fast-track process is unfair. The third area is around permanent protection and family reunion, so that when people seeking asylum are afforded protection, when they're found to be a refugee, that is permanent, and they don't have to keep reapplying, and that they can apply to bring their family here. The fourth area is around community-based processing, so that people's claims are processed in their community. They're not sent to Manus or Nauru. And then the last one is really about Australia's role in the region and leading a humane approach, so increasing our humanitarian intake and also being a role leader in the area of human rights in our region. So we've really got 5 clear areas that we're articulating, and our 2018 campaign, which we are launching on the 1st of March, will focus on those areas, and we will highlight one of those areas every couple of months in a different campaign and provide tactics and actions for people to take that will be online digital actions, and then also linking people in with their local groups, some of those groups I mentioned earlier, to be able to take greater in-depth action in their local areas. So it will be a big year. As I said, election year is always quite a large year, and we just don't know what will be thrown at us. In terms of policy change, we've already seen some, as I said, the removal of income support to people seeking asylum that started happening earlier this year. So we're really looking forward to it being a powerful year for people to really take action and to make change.
There's certainly some work to do.
There sure is, yeah. I know I'm making it sound very easy, but it's going to be a tough road ahead. But you've got to be 8 years in this role, I'm definitely a glass half full type person. And the community does have amazing potential, and they're so powerful. So it will be community-led action.
Okay. Thanks for taking the time to have a chat today, Jana.
No, thanks, Jana. Appreciate the time.
Jana Favero there from the Asylum Seeker Resource Centre, talking about her work and what lies ahead in the battle for better policy. Now it's time for the music. You heard this song at the top of the episode, and here it is again in full. Darabi from the Senegambian jazz band, taken from their self-titled debut album. Thanks to the band for letting me use the song and for making some excellent music. And thank you, dear listener, for listening. Please feel free to do so again. Bye.
maniko Salala maniko Kanam malundin funa mudunyala Kanam malundin jawlu tema Kanam malundin badi mudunyala Kanam malundin funa mudutema Kanam malundin sinyolu tema